Hello, church, and anyone else who might be tuned in. Today, as we continue our series of daily devotionals, we will be taking a break from the Psalms, and we'll be tracing Matthew's story of the last week of Jesus' life, the Passion account, as we celebrate this Holy Week together and prepare for Good Friday and Easter. So if you would join me in Scripture in Matthew 26, and take a moment to quiet yourself and maybe turn off any noise in the background and close out of any other tabs. Let's begin reading together. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble this woman? For she has done a beautiful thing for me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he reclined at table with the 12, and as they were eating, he said, 'Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me.' And they were very sorrowful, and began to say to him one after another, 'Is it I, Lord?' He answered, 'He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born.' Judas, who would betray him, answered, 'Is it I, Rabbi?' He said to him, 'You have said so.' Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in the kingdom of my Father.' And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee.' Peter answered him, 'Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away.' Jesus said to him, 'Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said, 'Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you.' And then all the disciples said the same." As Jesus' story continues towards the cross, there are these people and names, infamous and famous names, that are on either side of him. There are those that are plotting against him, whose names are known to us because they had such an influence in history, but they would have been known to everyone in Jerusalem at the time. People like Caiaphas, who, as the chief of the high priest, would have been one of the most powerful men in Israel, and who, as people today often thought that his power and his wealth could be used to control things the way that he wanted. He saw that Jesus was a problem, and so he was looking for a way to betray him, and along comes Judas, whose name is another one of those infamous ones, although at the time he was one of Jesus' famous disciples, who thinks that by joining together with Caiaphas, he, for whatever reason, can make things go the way he thinks they need to go and get rid of Jesus. And then there's those famous names, those good guys who were with Jesus. Names like Peter, considered to be one of, if not the founder of the early church. And yet, Jesus tells him, despite Peter's pleading that no matter what, he'll even die with him before he denies him, that he's going to fail him. And then there are people in that story whose names we don't even know. One in particular, a woman who anoints Jesus at one of the meals before the Last Supper, one of his last meals, out of an act of worship and adoration. And the disciples at first rebuke her because at first this is just scandalous that a woman should be touching Jesus. But secondly, they complain about the finances of the whole thing and the optics of the whole thing. Why waste this expensive ointment on Jesus when it could have been used to feed the poor, they say. But Jesus says, this woman has anointed my body for burial. And wherever the gospel is proclaimed throughout the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. But oddly enough, even though that story makes it into our scriptures, we don't know her name. And then there's this certain man, Jesus says, that in his house, in the upper room we call it, Jesus would celebrate the Last Supper, the Passover, with his disciples before he accomplished the Passover of God's people. We don't know that guy's name other than that he was a certain man. These two unnamed people, one, a woman who anoints Jesus' body for burial, and who, of all the people in the story, seems to understand where this whole thing is going. And then a man who we don't even know if he's a disciple, and yet he is willing to allow this space for Jesus to institute what we call the Lord's Supper, this living symbol of what it was that Jesus would do for us on the cross through his death and resurrection. And those two unnamed people end up having more power and influence than all the big names, good and bad, that end up in that story. The disciples who, despite their pleas of loyalty and faith, will fail him. And the enemies of Jesus, Judas and Caiaphas, who, despite their plotting, will not be able to keep him in the grave. And that ought to tell us something about the way of the cross that Jesus walks. Jesus chooses to walk a path amongst those who are unnamed, who were forgotten, who seemed powerless. In fact, Jesus is willing to become one of the unnamed, powerless victims of history, crucified between two criminals, because that's where God meets us. When we feel forgotten, when we feel powerless and unnamed, when we feel like what we have done in our faith or what we have done in our life and our work has been forgotten or neglected or doesn't make a difference, we know that Jesus walked the way of the cross so that every act of service, every act of love would matter. Every time we anoint Jesus by our actions and our love, every time we make a space for Jesus to enter into our world. But it also causes us to pause before we assume that those who seem to be so powerful are in control. Or when we think that we're pretty big and important and we're in control. Because the way of the cross, those who think that they are in control, whether for the good side and the faith they bring to the table, or the controlling side that thinks they don't need God and that we can run things how we want and plot how we want, the cross conquers those who think they are powerful. So remember what true power is. Remember what ends up mattering in the story of the cross, and that no one is forgotten as Jesus goes with us all the way to the bottom. The Lord bless you, church.